It's good to be back amongst friends. Friends from high school. I went to Long Beach Wilson, graduated in 1962. Friends from college. I went to Whittier College, like President Nixon, except I graduated in 1966. And friends from the Nixon White House, where I served for 5 years. I don't know that any of my friends from Harvard Law School are here, but if you note on the book, on the cover, my criminal law professor, Alan Dershowitz, said some very nice things about me. So, in addition to the above, as Jim mentioned, I was deputy counsel on President Nixon's Watergate defense team. And I was there throughout the scandal and its unfolding. I transcribed the White House tapes. I ran the document rooms holding the seized files of the Watergate defendants. And I staffed Nixon's counselors on Watergate issues. As you all know, it ended rather badly. President Nixon resigning in disgrace and 24 members of his administration going to jail. I've pondered ever since what exactly went wrong in our response to that burgeoning scandal, without really coming up with any answers. That is, until I learned some time ago that the Watergate prosecutors' files, at least those that survived, are maintained at our National Archives. The prosecutors were, after all, technically government employees. I've spent a lot of my time ever since reviewing those files, and that's a bit about what I'm going to talk to you tonight. But it's been 50 years since the scandal, and the backstory is rather complex, so we're going to approach this in two ways. I'm going to give you my own 1-minute summary, and then I'm going to expand a little bit on that. Nixon was defeated, but it turns out the prosecutors cheated. They also left a paper trail, and that's what I've been spending the past few years uncovering. It's simply astonishing what they committed to writing, and their documents change everything we've been told about Watergate. They met secretly with Watergate trial judges. They suppressed evidence that was favorable to the defendants. They told outright lies to grand jurors and to congressional committees alike. And none of this was pursued by the press, by the so-called investigative reporters. There were clear leads at the time of what was going on, but those leads were never followed up because any such information wouldn't fit in with a narrative that was being told, that was being fed to the American public. It's taken 50 years, but the truth is finally coming out, and the memos I've uncovered are now all publicly available. You know, when they talk about the scientific method in sciences other than political science, they talk about the ability to duplicate the experiment. The whole point of the scientific method is, here's what I did. If you do the same thing, you should get the same result. What distinguishes my work, I think, from everyone else's on Watergate is I constantly cite memos. The memos exist. They are available now to the public at the National Archives. Now let's dig a little bit deeper into the scandal, because it gets pretty complex. But I suggest to you there are 3 things you can take to the bank. There are 3 undeniable truths about Watergate. There really was a break-in. There really was a cover-up. President Nixon really did resign. And everything else is up for grabs. Everything else you've been told is subject to question in light of what I've uncovered. So let's talk about the break-in. 5 burglars were caught red-handed on June 17th, 1972, in the Watergate offices of the Democrat National Committee. There was a thorough investigation. But it wasn't necessary for prosecutors to establish who had known of the break-in plans in order to convict the burglars. The career prosecutors decided to pursue the easy convictions first and then see if facing long jail terms loosened their tongues. This approach really frustrated the self-appointed trial judge, Chief Judge John Sirica. He wanted to use the trial in his private search for the truth, whatever that was, behind Watergate. Perhaps as frustrating, at the opening of trial, 5 of the defendants pleaded guilty. So the trial really didn't amount to much. And at the end of it, the judge expressed his disappointment, called for a Senate investigation, and gave prosecutors a list of 8 Nixon people he demanded be brought in front of the grand jury. Well, the judge wasn't all wrong because there really was a cover-up. You see, when the burglars were caught, the question was who else knew? Who knew in advance of this planned break-in? And it turned out some pretty senior people had advanced knowledge. But it's very clear that those people, with the possible exception of John Dean, all worked for the committee to reelect the president, the reelection campaign committee. It's never been shown that any senior officials on the White House staff itself had advanced knowledge of the planned break-in. But the cover-up sucked some of them in. So the old saying about it's not the crime, it's the cover-up comes true, because if we had stopped the movie at the time of the break-in, people on the White House staff would not have been adversely affected, except for John Dean. So if you want to picture what happened, it's better to assume John Dean worked for the reelection committee, not for the White House he was supposed to represent. When the cover-up fell apart, as it should have, its instigators raced to make their own deals with the prosecution. The situation became hugely politicized. We see that today. When prosecutions become politicized, they go off the rails. A new force was brought in, created from scratch, the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, and consisted of 100 people from the beginning. It operated without guidance or supervision of the Department of Justice. And it promised to investigate every allegation of wrongdoing lodged against the Nixon administration since it first took office. In its own way, it was something of a legal pogrom. Specially recruited and highly partisan prosecutors operating without any budgetary or manpower restraints, targeting loads of specific Nixon people for investigation and prosecution. Well, that took its toll, and that brings us to our third undeniable truth. President Nixon really did resign. Haunted by his Oval Office tapes, hounded by the special prosecutors, he announced his resignation in an address to the nation on August 8th, 1974. He was then pardoned by President Ford, but 24 members of his administration were convicted and sent to prison in the break-in, the cover-up, and the Plumbers trials. Now, this is interesting. President Nixon was never brought in before an actual trial. He wasn't tried in court, and there was no actual Senate trial. In either of those 2 instances, his guilt would have had to have been proven under the rules of evidence by witnesses under oath subject to cross-examination. But that was skipped. So the formal presentation of what Nixon was accused of having done never got into court, never got before the Senate. Now, he was convicted, all right, by the media. He was convicted by the Senate Irvin hearings, and he was convicted in the court of public opinion, but nothing formal. And that gap leaves plenty of room for doubt and for discussion. In between the break-in arrests and President Nixon's resignation and then the conviction of his senior aides were 2.5 years of Watergate stories as the scandal unfolded. And all America was mesmerized by the Senate hearings, by the prosecutions, and by the impeachment inquiry in the House. We're now in the midst of the 50th anniversary of that period. This past Labor Day marked the 50th year from the Fielding break-in. That was the break-in into the Beverly Hills offices of Daniel Ellsberg's shrink, looking to see what his plans might be for further leaks like the Pentagon Papers. It's not really connected to Watergate, but the break-in was planned and executed by Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, who were connected. So it planted the seeds that blossomed into the Watergate scandal. Right about this time, right about Thanksgiving, 50 years ago, John Dean was recruiting Gordon Liddy to design a campaign intelligence plan. It's unfortunate that he picked Gordon. It's unfortunate that Gordon got a little carried away with his plan. It involved proposals for mugging, bugging, kidnapping, and prostitution. So one of the fair things to say is that some of Nixon's people were hardly blameless in all this. The question was how high up the rot went, and that's where all the arguments exist even to today. As Watergate unfolded, a heavily partisan media helped to assure that the victors were lionized, that the vanquished were villainized, and afterwards they told us the system had worked and that justice had prevailed. Well, not exactly. In fact, given what I've uncovered, you might conclude that the system didn't work and there was no justice for the Watergate defendants. Those things are covered. When Jim talked about my book, he didn't hold it up, so let me hold up my book, which is available to you today. It's my view of what happened back then, coupled with 50 years of disclosures based on my research. It's sort of a personal memoir of my involvement and a top-down review of how we would view Watergate today. There are three reveals in the book and in today's circumstances that make it very relevant to what's going on today. First is the unsealing of the Watergate roadmap. Second is the discovery of caches of documents that were improperly hidden from public view, prosecutors' documents. And third is the filing of a complaint of attorney misconduct. And I'll go through each of those for you because that's what makes it fun today, 50 years later. When the prosecutors decided that it was inappropriate to try to indict a sitting president, they settled on helping arrange his impeachment. And the way they decided to help was to take grand jury evidence that they had gathered for criminal prosecutions and convey it to the House of Representatives where it could be used to secure Nixon's impeachment. And they prepared a secret report. And it was called the roadmap because we were assured it would lead to Nixon's impeachment. It contained secret evidence that would certainly lead to his impeachment. But since it was sealed grand jury information, it was also sealed from public disclosure. And members of the White House defense team never knew what was in the roadmap. But the American public was assured, whatever it was, Nixon was guilty because it was irrefutable. The prosecutors said so. The roadmap remained secret for 45 years. And it was only recently made public in 2018 in response to my court petition. So for the first time in 45 years, we could learn what the accusations were against Richard Nixon. And you won't know of them because they disappeared. It turns out that the accusations included the charge that Richard Nixon had personally approved the payment of blackmail to one of the Watergate burglars. Now, in those days, it's different today, but in those days, There hadn't been an impeachment for 100 years. And it was generally believed that in order to void an election, to remove the president, you had to show he personally had committed a crime as grievous as treason or bribery, which are named in the Constitution. And the special prosecutors said, don't worry, we've got it. We can prove beyond the shadow of a doubt Nixon personally approved the payment of blackmail to Howard Hunt. We can tell you when he did it. But this charge was conveyed in secret. So I didn't learn about it until 2019 when I got around to reading the roadmap. The second important development recently is the discovery of confidential prosecutor files. In recent years, I've uncovered 4 caches of internal documents that the prosecutors took when they left office. Now, you aren't supposed to do that. These are government documents, but it's no wonder they took them. The prosecutors have incredible powers, particularly when coupled with the use of a grand jury. But they have to work within certain rules of conduct, reflecting the due process guarantees set forth in the Fifth and the Sixth Amendments. Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski's confidential Watergate files surfaced in 2013, 40 years after the fact. Those of Philip Lacavara, counsel to the special prosecutor, the one who did most of the staff work for the special prosecutor, surfaced in 2020. Both caches of documents are available today at the National Archives. Those of Archibald Cox, the first special prosecutor, and of his top assistant, James Vorenberg, are now available at Harvard's Law Library. They've declined to return them to the archives where they should be, but you can see them at Harvard. In each of these 4 instances, in each of these 4 caches of documents, I was the first to have access, treasure troves of new information. And what I've uncovered detail incredible wrongdoing by the prosecutors. They were so eager to nail Nixon, and there was no supervision from the Department of Justice, that they got carried away. And what is just astonishing to me, not that they got carried away, you could predict that, but they wrote memos bragging about it, and I've got the memos. The third development is the filing of a complaint of attorney misconduct. And this is, honestly, this is delicious. It's not in the book, but this is delicious. The Department of Justice established, after Watergate, a special internal affairs unit whose only job is to investigate and report on allegations of misconduct by Department of Justice attorneys. They have incredible power, but this is an internal affairs unit whose job is to make sure they didn't overstep their bounds. On October 3rd, which is 2 months ago, I filed a formal complaint of attorney misconduct about what the Watergate Special Prosecution Force attorneys did 50 years ago. And I filed it electronically the same day I discovered this group existed. And then the next day I sent them my books, which detail the documents and the wrongdoing. And then about a week later, I sent a registered letter, and I said, now don't think you're going to be getting out of this because this is 50 years ago, because the same attorneys who did wrong, who cut too many corners, are the ones who took their documents with them and prevented discovery of their wrongdoing. So this is ripe. Now, all I've heard back is official notice that they've received the complaint and they will launch an investigation. But this is really delicious. Ordinarily, when I'm at a cocktail party or something and people come up, you know, what about Watergate? And I start telling them, their eyes glaze over because the facts are complex and the stories are too convoluted, and they decide to go get another drink. But this group, this is their job. I just hope and pray I'm granted an audience, because I could go on for weeks about the wrongdoing done by these specially selected prosecutors. Now this, to kind of understand how this game ought to unfold, if you read detective stories, the hero is a tough cop who's trying to bring the bad guys to justice, and he cuts some corners in the name of pursuing justice. But every police department has an internal affairs unit, and these are the guys with straight spines who are sticklers for adherence right to the strict rules. And they're cast as the bad guys. Well, the Office of Professional Responsibility is that group within the Department of Justice. And if you go on my website, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, I've reproduced my complaint. So it will be interesting to see where that leads. I'd relish wallowing in Watergate with a group of prosecutors whose job it is to decide whether their colleagues cut too many corners, given the dozens and dozens of memos that I've uncovered. Now, I don't really care if those members of the Watergate Special Prosecution Force who are still alive, if they get disciplined, they've basically retired. But what I want, Shepard's goal, is for the Justice Department to come into court, like you may recall they did in the Senator Ted Stevens case, where they went in and they confessed error, and they said, we can't stand behind this conviction because of the wrongdoing by our own attorneys. Imagine for a second the upheaval that would cause if the Department of Justice disowned the convictions in the cover-up trial, in the Plumbers trial, and the naming of President Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator because of lies told to the federal grand jury. Well, all this except for that complaint, because it came after the book was at the publisher. All of this is extensively detailed and documented in my revised website, www.shepardonwatergate.com. Now, those of you who happen to be lawyers may remember from law school, the prominent professors all had casebooks, and they were inevitably named after themselves as authors. So it was Prosser on torts, and Chadbourne on evidence, and Kasner and Leach on real property, and Gellhorn and Bice on administrative law. Well, I consider myself to be an authority on the Watergate prosecutions, so I've named my website, my digital casebook is named shepardonwatergate.com. Most authors develop their website to sell their books. I want you to buy my book. But my website approaches this differently. It has more detail about Watergate than you might ever want to know. It has links not just to the troubling memos in my books and my essays, but some peripheral things, to my complaint of attorney misconduct. You can see it, it's right there. You can read it. To the off-Broadway stage play that we produced this past August. It's called Trial on the Potomac, and it's kind of fun. It portrays the impeachment trial that President Nixon might have received if he hadn't resigned. The only stickler is everything I've uncovered since comes out at that trial. And the audience is left to ponder, if everything we know today was known back in 1974, could the Democrats have mustered the 67 votes necessary to remove him? We don't know, but that's what the play asks. I also did 9 hours of video interviews with Hugh Hewitt here at the library in 2020. That's posted. And I did 18 hours of lectures at Temple University in Philadelphia in 2019. Now, the Hugh Hewitt lectures are all oral and more fun. The Temple lectures are accompanied by about 200 slides, PowerPoint slides, citing documents or portions of books that build a case for all of the wrongdoing. What my wife of 48 years terms my Nixon obsession has been all-consuming. Imagine what she goes through. But by making my research available online, I hope to make the true story of Watergate prosecutors, really the persecution of Nixon and his top staff, publicly available to students, to scholars, to researchers, and over time, to bend the arc of history. It's pretty much agreed today that the first impeachment of Andrew Johnson back after the Civil War was politicized and baseless. It's growing that there's agreement that the 1960 election was stolen from Richard Nixon. It's not such an outlandish thought at all. I hope I live long enough to see a situation where it becomes generally agreed, or at least understood by a number of people, that the Watergate prosecutions were not done fairly, were not done with regard to the Fifth and Sixth Amendments, that in a time of national political turmoil, the guarantees of our Constitution didn't withstand the onslaught of partisan prosecutors. You see, Nixon really was driven from office by a secret cabal of specially recruited prosecutors, vindictive judges, and highly partisan congressional staff. The documents I have uncovered prove it. I'm eager to take questions.
Thank you, Geoff.
Thank you. Chris?
Geoff has agreed to take your questions. Raise your hand up. I will come to you. We'll get through as many as we possibly can. I'd like to ask the first question.
Sure, Chris.
During your introduction, Jim mentioned that you were a bit frustrated with the Watergate scandal. And I'm curious when the moment in time in your life, when did that change from when, what was the revealing document or the revealing element that made you realize that the president was being falsely accused?
Restore my faith. Not why did I lose faith, that's the smoking gun tape. Restoration. I was on his defense team. We were gearing up to defend the president in the House in a Senate trial. And we thought the prosecutors believed, everything turned on what Nixon did on Wednesday, March 21st, 1973, when John Dean came in and said, you know, there's a cancer on the presidency. It's growing, it's compounding. You're going to have to make some pretty important decisions very soon, and you don't know what's been going on. We're being blackmailed. Nixon and Dean have both maintained consistently that that's the first time he ever told Richard Nixon about any specifics of the cover-up. That's where the battle was going to be joined. But then out of nowhere, that's March 21st, 1973, out of nowhere came this smoking gun tape from June 23rd, 1972, right after the Watergate break-in. Nobody knew about it. There was nothing else having to do with it. It was a big surprise to the lawyers. Lawyers made a mistake. To my great shame, the lawyers misinterpreted the tape, demanded it be released. It destroyed Nixon's credibility, and he resigned 3 days after its release. But that juxtaposition of we were all geared up to fight here, and this thing popped out. And what started it was doubt about that thing. And I started learning stuff from other authors and other analysts who said that wasn't designed to cover up. That was designed to protect the identity of two major donors who happened to be Democrats. It took me a lot of time of research, and I was ready to make that case when John Dean published a book in 2014 called The Nixon Defense. And a footnote at page 55, if you care to look it up, he says, you know, funny thing, the smoking gun's been misunderstood all along. His lawyers misinterpreted it. It was really to protect these donors. And if Nixon had known, he could have lived again to fight another day. I'm quoting. In short, the smoking gun was shooting blanks. So I went back, forget that, forget the smoking gun, it was a mistake. I'm sorry, but it was a mistake. Come back forward to March 21st. Now, I transcribed the tapes. This is a long answer, Chris, but you asked. I transcribed the tapes. They are hard to transcribe. These are not easy conversations. The audio quality is terrible. So when you're transcribing them, you're reaching for the words. You're trying to get inside the head of the speaker. Where are they going with this conversation? Now, to be fair, the initial cut at those transcriptions was done by Rose Woods, the president's secretary, and her assistant, Marge Acker. But Fred Bazart told me that we're turning these tapes over, and we've got to know what's on them. You can follow the conversation. They probably couldn't. But we can't be surprised if there's something on those tapes. So get every word you can. Well, that's hard work. And I believe there are very, very few people who have listened to the tapes. And there aren't very many who have really studied the transcripts. But in my view, and I'll go up against anybody with this view, he's told about the blackmail on Wednesday, March 21st by John Dean. And the answer of that meeting is getting John Mitchell down here from New York. Let's figure out what on earth to do. They meet again that evening, and they don't know what to do. Mitchell's coming down the next day. They think Mitchell's guilty as he can be, and the goal is get Mitchell to take a fall. That's how we're going to get out from under this. But the next day, Mitchell's not interested in taking a fall. And what they come up with is we'll send John Dean to Camp David. It's right there on the tape. He will write a report. He'll write a report of what he told me the day before. And I will use that report to call for a new investigation, and I won't claim executive privilege. My staff will have to go back. Now, it's a little unclear on the tape whether they mean back to the Irvin Committee, where it will be public, or back to a grand jury where it will be private. And there's no question they don't want that report to say too much. Okay, put it as favorably as you can, but there's no doubt on that tape Nixon is going to call for a renewed investigation and not claim executive privilege. That's when it rebuilt my faith in the president. Picture, this is unfair to President Nixon, picture this kid in knickers raised by a devout Quaker mother who says, now, Dickie, don't lie. The truth is always going to come out. Don't dig yourself in deeper. And it was a spasm response from the president. People don't understand that. When he used to talk about Alger Hiss, the communist from Harvard, it wasn't, and I beat him. It was, Hiss was a communist in the 1930s. The statute had passed. What got him in trouble was he lied about it. That's what brought him down. And Nixon, the furthest thing from his mind would be to lie. So he's told this terrible thing. His staff, he didn't want to send him to jail, but his reaction is, we got to have a new investigation. That's a long answer to your question, my friend. Next.
It was an answer and it was good. Thank you. Our first question from the audience.
Why did Nixon force Richard Kleindienst out as Attorney General? Kleindienst, a Goldwater man, would never have hired Archibald Cox, who was a Kennedy man.
Kleindienst asked to resign because of his closeness to John Mitchell. Kleindienst was Mitchell's deputy. It was becoming fairly clear that Mitchell was in deep trouble. After John Dean had hired Gordon Liddy and Gordon developed this plan, they went over to Mitchell's office. In fact, it's kind of ironic, if I may. Liddy shows up on December 10th, not too far from today, 50 years ago. And he's talking about $500,000 or $1 million for this campaign intelligence plan. And Jeb Magruder, who is the acting head waiting for Mitchell to come over from the Department of Justice, he says, gee, the only person with authority to commit that amount of money is John Mitchell, and he's not here. We have to go see John. So they troop over to the Attorney General's office, John Dean, Jeb Magruder, and Gordon Liddy. And Gordon presents this incredible plan in the Attorney General's office. And then they went back a second time. So Mitchell and Dean were both worried about guilty knowledge of the planned break-in advance. Henry Peterson came over to see the president and said, John Dean is telling us stuff you wouldn't believe. You're going to have to remove Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and Mitchell's going to be in real trouble too. So Kleinding said, I can't be a part of this. It's appropriate that I resign. The unfair thing is that the president begged Kleindingst to let him announce his departure at the same time he was announcing the departure of Haldeman and Ehrlichman and John Dean. And that was unfair to Dick Kleindingst. There was a task force set up designed to bag Kleindingst because of the ITT hearings. He pled to a misdemeanor. He and dozens of other people's reputations were ruined. But it wasn't Nixon's idea that Kleindingst should go, it was Kleindingst's idea.
Our next question, sir.
Hi. Do you think, had there been an alternate media back in '73, like Fox News, that things would have come out like they did in the investigation against Donald Trump?
A good question. And of course, the short answer is I don't know. The situation back in the 70s was dramatically different from today. There were only 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. There were 2 influential papers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and there were 2 weekly news magazines, Newsweek and Time. And they were uniformly liberal. We called it the liberal Eastern establishment. No Fox News, no talk radio, no podcasts, no alternate point of view. So either what you had to say was consistent with their narrative, or it never saw air. There was no other side. We could not get our news out. No investigation of wrongdoing by the other side. There were indications. One of my favorite, and I think it's in the back of this book, it's at least referenced, Bob Woodward's notes are at the University of Texas. And he was the first person to interview Leon Jaworski after Jaworski had left Washington. And Jaworski left before the cover-up trial was underway. So on December 5th, 1974, he's sitting down with Jaworski, and he must have said, wow, you caused quite a change in Washington. You know, you got Nixon to resign, you handled it through the pardon. And then there's this quote, it's typed, so you can't miss it. Says there were a number of one-on-one conversations that only he and the other party know about. And then the next paragraph, this is the top page of the interview. The next paragraph, Jaworski goes on to say, you know, the House impeachment inquiry really didn't have any idea what they were doing. So we staffed them. We supplied them with what they needed to bring their charges against Nixon. Well, here are 2 incredible leads for Bob Woodward. I mean, who could Jaworski be talking about? He was talking about meetings, secret meetings with Judge Sirica. There wasn't anybody else, because we know now that they occurred. But there was no follow-up. There was no interest in the story on the other side. And I blame that on the desire to meet with a narrative. Today, unfortunately, you have 2 narratives. And it's almost like different things happen. You don't talk. Half the nation gets their news from one source and half from another. It's very unfortunate. You cannot be certain of anything you read. That's why I started out by saying there are only 3 facts you can count on. There was a break-in, there was a cover-up, and Nixon really did resign. It's really a terrible situation today, and it's not just one side. Both sides are so eager to have you believe their point of view, they cut corners. So, but the answer is, I don't know if it would have been different or not. It would have been different if this stuff had come out. You know, any of the convictions would have had to be vacated. They might have been retried. A fair trial for Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Mitchell might properly have been held in Richmond, Virginia, or Baltimore, Maryland. We might have learned, it wouldn't have been presided over by Judge Sirica, that's for blessed sure, and we might have heard more testimony by and about John Dean. Here's a guy who masterminded the cover-up and walked free. Absolutely walked free. I mean, he's sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison, but Sirica writes in his book it was done to establish his credibility as a witness. And then a week after the convictions are secured, he's set totally free. And then it turns out he never spent a night in jail. He was assigned to a witness holding facility. And John Dean, in 3 separate interviews, much more recently, he said, you know, I never went to prison. And it's almost like he believes he wasn't found guilty. You know, that the witness protection program was for his safety, which of course is nonsense. Who else? Who is brave enough to ask a question?
To your right, sir.
Yeah.
Sir.
You sort of answered part of what I was thinking about. Do you think any of these people with the information that you've discovered will now take it and decide to, I wouldn't say contrition, but would begin to have a more open, I mean, not just the people that you mentioned, but I'm thinking news people who that generation created their whole image on that and stuff.
Built their reputations.
Yeah. Right.
Let me give one diversion first. Before Woodward and Bernstein, this is my memory, you had reporters, and that was news, and you had opinion writers, and those were on the editorial page. And the reporters' names weren't carried under their story. They just reported on the story, and journalism schools taught who, what, where, why, and when, the 5 W's. Woodward and Bernstein became world famous, movie stars, and got rich. And they got to sign their names. And thousands of people went into investigative journalism. And today, every news story is signed. And the person writing that story is tempted to make it as sensational as possible so you'll remember their name. So you don't get news, you get, here's what I think you should think about what happened today. Now, give me your question again. Yes. Oh, the contrition, now that the truth is coming out. Well, no, of course not. That would be too fun. Nobody has ever disputed a single fact in my books. I have the documents. I mean, what are you going to say? Oh, no, we did. He wrote about a secret meeting with Sirica, but we didn't really do it. I'm told there are 4 stages when someone publishes a book you disagree with. And the first and the foremost is ignore it. Ignore it. Say, well, I vaguely remember the guy, but he wasn't important, and I haven't read the book, so I can't comment on it. Or you pick out some little, there's a typo on page 32, so, you can't believe a thing he says. Only if others start to take the book seriously do you have to sit down and really slug through it. And I got to tell you, that hasn't happened, and it's unlikely to happen. People and I'm thinking if one person in particular out here at Chapman said, if you put Geoff Shepard on the program, I won't participate. And they disinvited me. It was really, that's an academic presentation. But John Dean is a movie star. John Dean was the big draw. They didn't want to lose John Dean. It was front page news in the Orange County Register that Shepard was disinvited. That's why this complaint of attorney misconduct is so delicious. I don't think they can get rid of me. And their dilemma, this is, you know, I analyze this stuff. I stay awake all night. Their best way out is to claim a technicality. Too long ago, most of the people are dead. These aren't really our memos. Because if they hear me out, they're going to be in tough shape. I have dozens and dozens of memos, and they're all on that website. I'm not playing hide the ball. Okay. The real Watergate victims have all passed away. There was some thought on an earlier book that their heirs could come in and challenge their convictions, but it never came to fruition. But this is different. This is challenging misconduct by the lawyers themselves. So we'll see.
We have time for one last question here.
Make
Goodness
it a
sakes,
good one.
I've always been interested in the role of John Dean. What was your impression of him at the very beginning?
John
When
Dean.
he first came to work for the Nixon White House, what was your immediate reaction or impression?
John Dean preceded me to the Nixon White House by a month. He's 5 years older. He was hired into a more senior position than I was. John Ehrlichman was the first counsel to the president, and he became head of domestic affairs and had the domestic counsel staff. And I think I was his first hire from the outside to be on the domestic counsel. And my area of responsibility was basically law and order, crime and drugs. So I worked very closely with the Department of Justice. When John switched from the counsel's office, he took everybody with him. And then he made a classic bureaucrat mistake. As his replacement, he hired somebody who was demonstrably less qualified and less experienced. He hired John Dean. And John Dean had no staff and basically nothing to do. He told his sentencing officer that his official duties were reviewing full field reports on potential presidential appointees and any pardons recommended by the Department of Justice. Well, I was doing policy work on crime and drugs. There is no indication that Dean met with the president more than one time in the first 2 years he was on the staff. So there was a project. I was in charge of the project, a public policy project, law and order, and Dean was supposed to contribute something. And he didn't. He didn't do any work. And I went into my immediate boss, Bud Krogh, and who'd brought Dean. He was the one who urged Dean be hired. And I said, don't ever put me on a project again with John Dean. Don't ever put Dean on a project with me. I was in charge. Because he didn't do squat. And he said, well, you know, he's very sensitive as to his rank here. He's new. Why don't you let me handle Dean from now on? I have more rapport. Which probably saved my freedom, because he sure helped Bud. He convinced Bud to perjure himself, and Bud lost everything because of John Dean. I didn't like John Dean. Most of his colleagues didn't like John Dean. He had an intriguing ability to appeal to his superiors, but not to his colleagues. And I could go on and on and on. He wasn't a serious guy. He wasn't really there. Dwight Chapin interviewed him before he became counsel, and he wrote a memo. And his memo says it would really be more comforting if we had someone who was loyal to Nixon. You know, this guy's out for himself. Turned out to be pretty true. Thank you very much for coming. This has been a real privilege. Thank you, my friend. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, the book is The Nixon, see, I'll hold it up now. The book is The Nixon Conspiracy. Get your copy in the gift shop, and Geoff is headed out there right now to sign copies. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you all soon. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
All right, I will go with you.